Hey there, night owls, history dreamers, or maybe just curious souls who wandered in. Let me ask you something. How does a poor orphan girl from a convent go on to rewrite the rules of what it means to be a woman? With nothing but a needle, a scandal, and a scent? This is not just fashion history. This is a revolution, stitched by hand and sealed with a bottle of Chanel No. 5. Before we dive in, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. Paris, Odessa, Tokyo, and now, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and let's unravel the legend of Coco Chanel, thread by thread. When Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel was born in the small French town of Saumur in the summer of 1883, no one blinked. No newspapers printed it. No stars fell. Her mother was a laundrywoman. Her father, a street vendor who sold undergarments from a cart. That was it. That was the beginning. Silent, ordinary, and full of dust. By the time she turned 12, her mother was gone. Dead from exhaustion and tuberculosis, which back then often meant the same thing. Her father? He vanished too, not to heaven, but to a new life without her. He dropped Gabriel and her sisters at a convent orphanage and never returned. No letters, no visits, just absence. Now, you'd think that's where a story ends. Girl abandoned, raised by nuns, becomes a ghost in society's margins. But not Gabrielle. Because inside those stone convent walls, under candlelight and discipline, she learned two things: silence and sewing. The nuns at Aubazine taught the girls how to stitch and mend, not for art, for utility, for service. Clothes were to be clean, plain, and proper. No ribbons, no flair, no ego. But Gabrielle's fingers didn't just mend, they transformed. And in the stillness of the cloister, she began to imagine what the world might look like if the thread obeyed her, not tradition. She stayed there until she was 18, when she aged out of the system and was sent to a boarding school run by nuns who offered her work as a seamstress. There was no inheritance, no promises, just needle, thread, and ambition. And then something unexpected. She started singing. In a smoky cafe in Moulins, she performed in front of soldiers. Not exactly the Opera Garnier, but it was a stage. They called her Coco, maybe after a song she sang, maybe as a nickname from lovers. She never corrected them. She liked the sound of it. 2 sharp syllables, easy to remember, easy to sell. Coco. She wasn't a great singer, but she didn't need to be, because she understood something far more powerful than melody. She understood image, presence. She wore her own clothes, tailored, sleek, daring. Not like the lace-heavy, frilly cages other women wore at the time. She looked free, and that was shocking. In early 20th century France, women were corseted, buttoned and defined by layers of fabric, rules and expectations. But here was Coco in a man's jacket, with clean lines and no apologies. And people noticed. One of them was Etienne Balsan, a wealthy cavalry officer and textile heir. He took her in as a mistress, which at the time was one of the only ways a woman could access high society without a last name carved into a chateau. Balsan gave her horses, pearls, and access to a new world. But Coco didn't want to ride horses. She wanted to build an empire. In his estate, while other women lounged, she worked. She made hats. Clean, sharp, minimalist hats that didn't weigh down a woman's head like a pastry cart. Models wore them. Actresses loved them. And word spread. But here's what mattered. She didn't just sell hats. She sold a new idea of womanhood, elegant, practical, and untethered from male expectations. Still, society saw her as a decoration in a rich man's world, a clever mistress with a pretty ribbon, until a man named Arthur Capel, Boy to his friends, walked in. Boy Capel was a businessman, a polo player, and unlike Balsan, someone who saw Coco's mind before her beauty. He believed in her. He gave her a loan to open her first boutique, not as a favour, as an investment. Deauville. That's where it began, and that's where we'll pick up next time, with a storefront by the sea, a war on the horizon, and a woman about to cut fashion's tightest threads. Because Chanel wasn't born in silk. She was stitched together by survival. Deauville, 1913. The wind off the Normandy coast always carried the smell of salt and seaweed. But that summer, something new was in the air. Chanel. Coco had opened her very first shop. A modest boutique nestled near the beach promenade, funded by Arthur Boy Capel. The name on the window? Chanel Modes. Inside, she sold hats, sailor-inspired blouses, and garments made from jersey. Yes, jersey. The fabric of men's underwear. Soft, flexible, and cheap. No self-respecting couturier in Paris would touch it. But Coco wasn't from Paris. She wasn't even trained. She was self-made, self-taught, and stubborn enough to dress society's finest women in what they used to sleep in. And you know what? They loved it. Because Deauville wasn't Paris. It was a resort town. Women rode horses. They walked along windy beaches. They were tired of corsets, of sweat under whale-boned bodices. Coco gave them freedom in the form of fabric. Loose, flowing silhouettes. A bit of masculinity, but with charm. Effortless. Understated. Dangerous. While other designers worshipped embroidery and lace, Coco cut straight lines, clean, elegant, modern. Her designs didn't shout, they whispered, and that whisper spread fast. But here's the twist. Coco was still seen by many as a kept woman, a woman made by men. First Balsan, now Capel. She lived well. She had a driver, a wardrobe, pearls, horses, but not a name in her own right, and that bothered her, deeply. She once said, "There have been several Duchesses of Westminster. There is only one Chanel." That wasn't pride. That was prophecy. Still, for now, she played the part. Capel loved her, but he wouldn't marry her. He was expected to wed someone of aristocratic blood, not an orphan girl who sold hats and dared to think of trousers for women. And yet Coco didn't spiral into tragedy. She doubled down on her work. She opened another shop in Biarritz this time, right on the border with Spain. And when World War I began and men were shipped off to the front lines, women entered the workforce by the millions. And guess what they couldn't wear? Petticoats, silk, constricting gowns. They needed practicality, movement, dignity without fragility. And Coco was ready. She didn't just read the times, she tailored for them. In Biarritz, her designs exploded. She hired over 300 women. Her clientele ranged from war widows to working girls to aristocrats who ditched their titles for factory jobs. Her clothes didn't care where you came from. They cared how you moved through the world. But success came at a cost. In 1919, tragedy struck. Boy Capel, the man who believed in her first, died in a car crash on the road to Cannes. He was 38. Coco was devastated. For the rest of her life, she would speak of that moment as the day her real love died. It was also the day she realized no one was coming to save her. No one would carry her to greatness. If she wanted to be a legend, she'd have to become one herself. She turned grief into drive, mourning into momentum. Within months, she opened her flagship boutique at 31 Rue Cambon in Paris, the address that would one day become sacred ground in the fashion world. It wasn't just a shop, it was a statement, a temple to independence, simplicity, and the Chanel woman, who was now becoming an archetype. No longer a muse, no longer a mistress, a movement. She began to build her look, the cropped hair, the tailored blazers, the long strings of pearls over black dresses. She blurred the lines between masculine and feminine, rich and poor, proper and rebellious. And people couldn't look away, because Coco Chanel wasn't just designing clothes anymore. She was designing identity. Her women smoked cigarettes in public. They drove cars. They didn't ask permission. They didn't dress for husbands or rules. They dressed for themselves. And that, in the early 1920s, was revolutionary. Still, her empire wasn't complete. Not yet. She had the clothes. She had the shops. But she was about to bottle something that would make her name eternal. In the next episode, we'll open a tiny glass flask that smells like aldehydes, musk, and immortality. You may know it as Chanel No. 5. But behind the scent, a story of betrayal, branding, and a very expensive mistake. When the guns of the First World War thundered across Europe, they didn't just shatter borders, they shattered corsets. In 1914, as millions of men were conscripted into uniform, millions of women were forced into something they'd never worn before: responsibility. They worked in factories, ran farms, nursed the wounded, and kept entire nations on their feet. And they couldn't do that wearing whalebones and floor-length velvet. This is where Coco Chanel's quiet rebellion became a revolution. Her garments had always been different, simple, comfortable, a little shocking. But now, they were necessary. The war didn't just create a market for Chanel, it validated her vision. Suddenly, what she was designing wasn't scandalous, it was practical, and it was selling. In Biarritz, her workshop ran at full speed. Jersey, once laughed at, became the fabric of modern life. Straight lines, looser cuts, dresses that didn't suffocate, trousers, yes, actual trousers for women, that allowed them to walk, work, and breathe like never before. And Chanel didn't shout her feminism. She wore it, she sold it, she lived it. There's a story that during these years she took a pair of sailor's pants, tailored them for herself, and walked along the seaside promenade like it was a runway. Women stared, some whispered, but a few, a very important few, followed. And that's what Coco understood. Fashion doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be seen. By the end of the war, her influence had spread far beyond France. And so had her message, that elegance didn't come from excess. It came from confidence, clarity, and control. But not everyone was on board. The traditional Parisian fashion houses, places like Worth and Poiret, still clung to the past. They draped women in ruffles, laced them up, and insisted that femininity was something ornamental. Coco, on the other hand, was building something else. A silhouette that let a woman move, not just dance. In a society where even voting was still out of reach for most women, clothes were becoming weapons, symbols, and Chanel was sharpening the blade. She introduced something else radical: black. Now today, black is the most common color in any closet. But back then, black was for mourning, for widows, for housemaids. You didn't wear black to a party unless someone had died. So what did Chanel do? She made it iconic. In 1926, she released what would later be dubbed the Little Black Dress. Vogue called it the Ford of fashion, meaning it was sleek, modern, and accessible. Like a Model T, it could go anywhere. Dinner, opera, the office. It was democratic luxury, and it changed everything, because Chanel understood that fashion wasn't just for the rich, it was for the clever, the daring, the woman who knew that power didn't always come with diamonds. Sometimes it came with a collarbone and a clean line. But here's where it gets interesting. She didn't consider herself political. She once said, "I don't do fashion, I am fashion." What she meant wasn't arrogance, it was ownership. She didn't follow trends, she made them. She didn't ask what women wanted to wear. She asked what they needed to feel free, and then designed that. Of course, freedom comes at a cost. Her workaholic drive kept her restless, often alone. She was known to be ruthless in business, cool in relationships, and obsessive over her image. She could charm a room and cut down a rival in the same sentence. She burned bridges, she built empires, and she never, ever apologized. But then again, that was the point. She was not trying to be liked. She was trying to be remembered. And as the 20s roared forward and women across Europe and America cut their hair, shortened their hemlines, and lit cigarettes in public, one thing became clear. The Chanel woman was not just an idea. She was a movement. Coming up next, we'll step inside a perfumer's lab in Grasse where Coco Chanel was about to trap her entire philosophy, her power, her mystery, her independence, in a single glass bottle. And what happened next made her name immortal. By the early 1920s, Coco Chanel had already reshaped the fashion landscape. Her boutiques were thriving, her minimalist style had made headlines, and her name, just 5 letters, had begun to carry a gravity that few could ignore. But to Chanel, fashion was never just about fabric. It was about presence, about identity, and ultimately about how a woman could leave her mark on the world without ever saying a word. And so she set her sights on something more intimate than clothes, something that could linger in a room long after a woman had left it: perfume. At the time, the world of scent was both deeply traditional and socially stratified. On one end of the spectrum were the extravagant, syrupy perfumes worn by the upper class, heavy with rose, jasmine, and memories of the Belle Epoque. On the other end were cheap floral sprays used by working women to mask the realities of labor and sweat. There was no middle ground, and certainly nothing that reflected the modern, independent woman Coco was dressing. She envisioned a new kind of perfume, not one that imitated a flower, but one that evoked a feeling. It had to be abstract, clean, sensual, and unmistakably female. She wanted a scent that wouldn't merely adorn a woman, but would become part of her, like confidence, like elegance, like armor. That vision brought her to Ernest Beau, a Russian-born master perfumer who had once created scents for the Romanovs. They met in the hills of Grasse, the sun-drenched heart of the French perfume world, where Beau presented Chanel with a series of fragrance samples, each numbered rather than named, 1 through 10. She smelled them all, paused thoughtfully, and chose the 5th. Whether it was instinct, superstition, or symbolism, no one truly knows. But Chanel had always believed in signs, and the number 5, her childhood lucky number, held meaning for her. It was bold, round, unapologetic. Chanel number 5 was born. But this was more than just another perfume. It was, quite literally, a chemical revolution. For the first time, synthetic aldehydes were used not as filler, but as a defining note, giving the scent an airy, almost electric quality. It didn't. As the 1930s slipped into chaos and Europe tilted toward war once again, Coco Chanel was no longer just a designer. She was an institution. Her name was etched in luxury. Her perfume was worn by queens and actresses, and her boutique on Rue Cambon stood like a fortress of modernity in the heart of Paris. But even fortresses have fault lines. When the German army occupied Paris in 1940, the city was split between resistance and survival. For Chanel, the choice she made would haunt her legacy forever. Instead of fleeing, instead of hiding, she moved into the Ritz, the same Ritz hotel that, during the occupation, became the preferred residence for Nazi officers and collaborators. She claimed it was for convenience. After all, she had lived there on and off for years. But in occupied Paris, convenience came with consequence. It wasn't long before Coco was seen regularly with a man named Hans Günther von Dinklage, a German aristocrat and former military officer who served as a Nazi intelligence operative. Their relationship was not a whisper in the shadows. It was open, visible, and deeply controversial. And it raised the question, was Chanel merely surviving, or was she choosing a side? Some argued that her relationship with Dinklage was strategic, protection in a dangerous time, a way to keep her assets intact while others lost everything. But others pointed to more troubling signs. During the war, Chanel attempted to leverage Nazi influence to regain full control of her perfume empire from the Wertheimer family. Since the Wertheimers were Jewish and had fled France for America, she saw an opportunity, a loophole in Aryanization laws that allowed non-Jewish citizens to reclaim businesses deemed abandoned by Jews. It was a cold, calculated move, and it failed. The Wertheimers, knowing full well that their partnership with Chanel was at risk, had quietly transferred ownership to a non-Jewish associate before fleeing, effectively protecting their interests from seizure. Chanel's legal efforts collapsed, but the damage to her image was far more lasting. For a woman who had once symbolized independence, elegance, and even female liberation, her wartime behavior raised questions she would never fully answer. After the liberation of Paris in 1944, collaborators across France were arrested, punished, or executed. Women accused of sleeping with German officers were paraded through the streets with shaved heads. Chanel, for her part, was briefly detained and questioned by the Free French, but she was never charged. Some say it was due to lack of evidence. Others whisper that Winston Churchill, a personal acquaintance of hers through aristocratic English circles, may have intervened on her behalf. Either way, she walked free, while many others did not. But Paris did not forgive so easily. Facing whispers, outrage, and social ostracism, Chanel left. She exiled herself to Switzerland, settling in Lausanne with her wealth, her dogs, and her silence. She rarely spoke of the war years, and when she did, her version of events was always curated, careful, and just ambiguous enough to keep the truth at arm's length. For over a decade, she stayed away from fashion. The world moved on. Dior had arrived with his new look, cinched waists, flared skirts, a return to traditional femininity. Chanel hated it. She called it decorative. She called it regressive. She called it costume. But from her exile, she watched it rise. And finally, in the mid-1950s, she had had enough. She was over 70 years old, with more scandal behind her than success ahead of her, at least in the public eye. Yet, despite everything, despite the shadow of the occupation, despite the weight of lost reputation, Coco Chanel did something almost no one expected. She came back. And that's where we go next, to the most improbable chapter of them all. the comeback of a woman the world had written off, a woman past her prime, a woman some called traitor. But Coco, she still called herself Chanel, and she was about to remind everyone exactly what that meant. In the winter of 1954, Parisians gathered at 31 Rue Cambon once more, not out of loyalty or nostalgia, but curiosity. Coco Chanel, now 71 years old and long absent from the world she once ruled, was staging a comeback, and not a quiet one. She wasn't releasing accessories or perfume or relaunching old designs. She was opening a full couture house, again, right in the heart of post-war Paris, and many thought she had lost her mind. The world had changed. Dior's new look had dominated fashion for nearly a decade. With its wasp-waisted silhouettes, billowing skirts, and overtly feminine aesthetic, it was everything Chanel had always rejected. To her, it looked like a costume, a step backward, a return to the cages of the pre-war years. But to the press and much of the public, it was the new normal. And Coco? She was a relic, a scandal, a reminder of uncomfortable history. Yet Chanel never asked permission to re-enter. She simply walked back in. Her comeback collection featured slim tweed jackets, soft skirts that moved with the body rather than against it, blouses without frills, and the return of the understated little black dress. She introduced functional pockets, clean lines, and a new philosophy. Women shouldn't be shaped by their clothes. Their clothes should follow the woman. The reaction? Brutal. French critics called the collection outdated, even pitiful. They described it as a tired echo of old ideas. They mocked her for trying to fight Dior's dominance. Whispers of her wartime associations resurfaced, not loudly, but just loud enough to sting. But while Paris turned its nose up, America leaned in. American buyers who didn't carry the same wartime memories or cultural baggage, saw something else entirely. Timeless elegance, simplicity that cut through the noise. Clothing for working women, for ambitious women, for women who didn't want to be dressed like dolls. The American market fell in love with Chanel, again, or maybe for the first time. And slowly, so did the rest of the world. It wasn't a meteoric rise. It was a steady, stubborn climb. Chanel stuck to her vision, brushing off the critics with the same sharpness she once used to slash corsets from fashion. And gradually, her pieces began showing up on actresses, editors, and society women. The tweed suit became iconic. The gold chain shoulder bag became essential. Her aesthetic, once labeled masculine, severe, even unflattering, became the new standard of modern elegance. And behind all of it was Coco, tireless, precise, and still completely herself. She lived above her boutique in an opulent apartment filled with mirrors, lions, and crystal chandeliers. But she never slept there. Every night she returned to the Ritz Hotel, where fresh white sheets and room service awaited. Her days were strict, her routine unshakable. Up early, work all day, dine simply, and never ever reveal weakness. She was known for her sharp tongue. If she didn't like your shoes, she'd say so. If you asked for something she found vulgar, she'd simply walk away. But she was also known for an unmatched eye, a precision that turned cloth into confidence. To be dressed by Chanel was to stand straighter, to move smarter, to feel somehow more complete. And it wasn't just about fashion anymore. Chanel had become something bigger, a concept, a posture, a kind of freedom. She didn't follow trends. She rewrote the timeline. And yet, despite all this, Coco remained curiously alone. She never married. She had no children. Her great love, boy Capel, was long gone. Her closest companions were staff, her seamstresses, and the routines she never broke. Some say she chose loneliness. Others say it was the cost of greatness. But perhaps, for Chanel, solitude wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. She once said, "I imposed black. It still reigns." Another time, elegance is refusal. But the line that best captured her essence came much later. My life didn't please me, so I created my life. In that, she was perhaps more artist than designer. In the next episode, we'll look beyond the seams, into the contradictions, the coldness, the discipline, and the mystery of a woman who refused to be decoded, even as the world wore her initials around their necks. Because behind every icon is a person. And behind Chanel was someone far more complicated than anyone cared to admit. By the time Coco Chanel had regained her place at the top of the fashion world, she had become more than a designer. She was a living myth. Her name no longer needed explanation. Her logo, those interlocking C's, didn't just represent a brand. They represented an idea, a standard, a kind of cool authority that few dared question. But like most myths, the truth beneath was not so simple. Behind the velvet curtains of her Paris atelier, Chanel lived a life ruled by strict discipline and precise habits. She woke early, dressed immaculately, and worked with a focus that left no room for distraction. Even in her 80s, she reviewed every design, every stitch, and every seam. She was not interested in applause. She was interested in control. And control, for Chanel, was everything. She controlled her image, her surroundings, her staff, her schedule. Her famous apartment above the boutique, while richly decorated with Coromandel screens, camellias, and lion motifs, symbols of protection, purity, and strength, remained pristine, untouched by the chaos of everyday life. No one ever saw her sleep there. At night, she returned to the Ritz, as if the apartment was not a home, but a museum of herself, carefully curated and permanently on display. Her personal life was no less structured. She formed few close attachments, and even those were often transactional, wrapped in sharp wit and emotional distance. She famously avoided marriage, declaring that she never wanted to belong to anyone. "I never wanted to weigh more heavily on a man than a bird," she once said, and she meant it. To some, that made her cold. To others, fearless. But if you look closely, you see something else. A woman who built walls around herself because she knew what it was to be abandoned, and she had no interest in experiencing that powerlessness again. Chanel's feminism was not one of slogans or speeches. She never marched, she never campaigned. But her life, the life of a poor orphan who bent fashion to her will and carved her name into history, was its own kind of statement. She didn't believe in dependency. Not on men, not on trends, not on anyone. Yet her independence came with contradictions. For all her boldness, she relied on wealthy male patrons throughout her early career. For all her innovation, she dismissed avant-garde movements and younger designers with a wave of her hand. For all her sleek minimalism, her lifestyle remained luxuriously indulgent. And for all her success, she carried an almost pathological fear of losing relevance. There's a story, not widely confirmed but often repeated, that even in her 80s, Chanel would pace the mirror-lined stairwell above her showroom during runway shows, watching the reactions of her guests without being seen herself. She didn't want to be applauded as a relic. She wanted to feel she still had the room in her hands, and mostly, she did. But she rarely smiled about it. Chanel could be brutal to those who disappointed her. She dismissed longtime colleagues without hesitation. She held grudges. She revised history to suit her own version of events, often painting herself as a lone genius, untouched by others' influence. In her later years, she became more isolated, more rigid, less willing to adapt. And yet, her influence only grew. Perhaps that is the final paradox of Chanel. The more she withdrew from the world, the more the world came to embody her. Her clothes became symbols of professional power. Her fragrance became a rite of passage. Her name, once whispered through scandal, was now spoken with reverence. And through it all, she remained unknowable. Even those who worked closely with her for years admitted they never truly understood her. She had charisma, but not warmth. Charm, but rarely intimacy. She gave everything to the craft, and very little to connection. Was it loneliness? Was it pride? Or was it simply the price of living life entirely on her own terms? That question never got a clear answer, and perhaps that was her final act of control, to leave us guessing. Next time, we enter her final days, not with sadness, but with the kind of theatrical precision that would have made Coco herself proud. Because even in death, she refused to lose her grip on the story. On a cold Sunday in January of 1971, the corridors of the Ritz Hotel in Paris were unusually still. In Suite 213, overlooking Place Vendôme, Coco Chanel lay in bed, dressed, as always, with care. She had woken that morning, complained of feeling tired, and by evening, she was gone. She was 87 years old, and yes, of course, she died in style. For more than 3 decades, Chanel had made the Ritz her home. She had her own suite, her own linens, her own routine. The hotel staff adored her and feared her in equal measure. Her days were structured, her movements predictable. Each morning, she walked the short distance to Rue Cambon to inspect her atelier. Even when her body slowed, her eye never did. That final weekend, she had still been working, sketching designs, reviewing fabric swatches, fussing over sleeves. Her staff recalled her giving instructions on the new collection only hours before her death. It was as if she refused to allow anything, not even time, to interrupt the work. And then, without ceremony, she simply slipped away. When the news broke, Paris barely breathed. Chanel was not just a person, she was an era. She had outlived her rivals, her critics, and even her country's scandals. And yet, she had died not in a grand chateau, nor surrounded by family or friends, but alone in a hotel room, the same way she had lived, independent, unflinching, and untouched by convention. Her funeral took place at the Église de la Madeleine, a neoclassical church she herself had admired. Mourners gathered in silence, many of them dressed in Chanel, not out of tribute, but because they always did. On the pews, her models sat in the front row, heads bowed, wearing her designs like armor. And in the fashion world, silence is the loudest applause. There was no dramatic will, no final memoir, no tearful farewell. Chanel left no heirs, no children, no designated successor. Her life was her final collection, tightly edited, carefully styled, and impossible to replicate. But what she left behind was staggering. Her legacy was not stitched into a single dress or sewn into a single perfume bottle. It was written across decades of transformation. She gave women the right to wear black without mourning, to dress for themselves, to move through the world with ease, dignity, and quiet defiance. She made simplicity radical. She made comfort elegant. She made fashion human. And still, there were those who whispered about the war, about the lover with the wrong uniform, about the business deals that smelled more like strategy than loyalty. But even her critics had to admit, Coco Chanel never pretended to be innocent. She pretended to be inevitable. In the years that followed her death, the House of Chanel passed through uncertain hands. But then came Karl Lagerfeld, a flamboyant, sharp-eyed German designer who breathed new life into her vision. He modernized the brand without breaking its core. He protected the legacy while playing with its edges. And suddenly, the world remembered. The suits, the bags, the perfume, the woman. But Chanel was never just about the products. It was about the idea behind them, the conviction that elegance is not decoration, but decision. That style is not about wealth, but presence. That a woman need not shout to be heard. In death, as in life, Coco Chanel left a mark that could not be wiped away. She had once said, "Fashion fades, only style remains the same." And in that line, she buried her secret. She had never been designing dresses. She had been designing freedom, stitched quietly, tailored precisely, and worn bravely by generations to come. In our final episode, we'll step back and look at the full picture. Not just the woman, but the world she helped shape. We'll ask what it means to build a legacy, and how one orphan from Saumur managed to become the most powerful name in fashion history. And we'll reveal the one rule Chanel lived by, the rule she never broke, no matter how much the world changed around her. By the time the 20th century faded into memory, the world Coco Chanel had helped reshape had become almost unrecognizable. Women no longer needed permission to vote, to work, to own property, to speak. The silhouettes had shifted. The power had shifted. The voices had multiplied. And yet, the brand she built, the empire forged in grief, rebellion, and precision, stood firm. Chanel had become more than a fashion house. It had become a monument to timelessness, a kind of cultural shorthand for elegance, for intelligence, for mystery, for control. Across continents, women who had never read a word about Coco's life wore her designs, or imitations of them, without realizing they were participating in a revolution she had quietly sewn into the seams nearly a century before. The tweed jacket, once a symbol of rebellion against restrictive corsets, was now standard in corporate boardrooms. The little black dress, once an act of defiance, was now a fashion staple. Chanel No. 5, once dismissed for being too modern, remained the world's best-selling perfume. And this was no accident. Everything Coco Chanel did, from her branding to her fabrics, from her lovers to her loneliness, was part of a larger idea. That style should never be borrowed, never begged for, and never imposed. It had to be owned, embodied, chosen. That last time we followed Coco Chanel, a woman who rewrote fashion from the inside out. But while she was tailoring elegance in Paris, another empire was quietly rising in small-town America, built not on silk and perfume, but on volume, speed, and low prices. Sam Walton didn't walk runways. He walked aisles, and he turned everyday shopping into a global force. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and drop your hometown in the comments. And if you stay till the end, you'll learn the one rule he followed that helped him outsmart every giant who ever doubted him. Before Sam Walton ever ran a store, before he had trucks crossing state lines or aisles filled with everyday low prices signs, he was just a boy in overalls, born in Kingfisher, Oklahoma in the spring of 1918. It was the kind of place where you could see a dust storm coming from 40 miles out, and where survival wasn't a given. It was earned. His father, Thomas, was a hard-working farm appraiser, a job that meant constant travel, tight budgets, and zero tolerance for waste. The Waltons moved often, chasing opportunity through the Great Depression like millions of other families. Money was scarce. Food, sometimes more so. But the hunger Sam carried wasn't just for supper. It was for more. Even as a boy, he wanted to do things better, faster, smarter. By the age of 7, Sam had already found a way to contribute. He milked the family cow and sold the surplus to neighbors. Not because his parents told him to, because he figured it out himself. That was Sam's first taste of business. And it was sweet, even if the milk wasn't. In high school, the kid didn't slow down. He sold magazine subscriptions, delivered newspapers, parked cars at football games, and never, not once, turned down a paying opportunity. Friends remembered him as competitive, almost to the point of obsession. If he played basketball, he played to win. If he ran a school project, it had to be the best. And while he wasn't flashy, he was calculating, always watching, always measuring what worked and what didn't. That mindset followed him to the University of Missouri, where he studied economics, not because it sounded glamorous, but because he wanted to understand how money moved, how people made decisions, how supply met demand, and why some businesses thrived while others died with a handshake and a debt they couldn't cover. At college, Sam joined ROTC, was elected president of his fraternity, and held down multiple jobs. He didn't sleep much. He didn't party hard. He studied, he sold, and he watched people, how they spent, what they ignored, what made them come back to a place twice. And he took notes. Mental ones. But here's the thing about Sam Walton. He didn't dream about Wall Street. He didn't want to climb a corporate ladder in New York. He wanted to go where no one was looking. He believed the real opportunities weren't in cities with skyscrapers, but in small towns with broken sidewalks. Towns where people needed good products, fair prices, and a reason to keep their dollars close to home. After graduating in 1940, Sam landed his first real job at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, Iowa. He made $65 a month and drove a beat-up car to work, where he learned the ropes of retail from the inside. His manager once said he was a great salesman, but his handwriting was so messy they had to redo every sales slip he filled out. Still, they didn't fire him. Because even then, Sam was moving more product than anyone else on the floor. He learned a lot at Penny's. How to greet customers, how to organize shelves, how to track inventory. But he also noticed something else. Most stores were slow to change. They followed formulas. They assumed the customer would just adapt. Sam didn't buy that. He believed the store should adapt to the customer. Always. By the time World War II came knocking, Sam had already made up his mind. Retail was his future. But first, duty called. He joined the army, served as a communications officer, and rose to the rank of captain. He didn't see combat, but he saw systems, how things moved, how to organize people and supplies under pressure. It was, in many ways, the best business school he could have asked for. And when the war ended, he didn't waste a second. Armed with military discipline, economic know-how, and a small loan from his father-in-law, Sam went hunting for his first store. And what he found would launch the first spark of a billion-dollar blaze. Next time, we'll walk through the doors of a little five and dime in Newport, Arkansas, where a young Sam Walton would test out wild ideas, rearrange shelves, slash prices, and pull off a miracle, right before he lost it all. Before Sam Walton ever ran a store of his own, he was already quietly building the blueprint for it, not with a pen, but with a habit of watching people. He didn't just sell to customers. He studied them, how they walked, how they looked at price tags, how long they lingered, what made them hesitate, and what made them come back. This started early, while he was still at the University of Missouri. Sam wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was usually the sharpest observer. He studied economics, but spent just as much time studying human behavior. Not in textbooks, but in cafeterias, libraries, and small-town general stores. He wanted to know what made people tick, what made them spend, what made them loyal. Even during college, he never stopped working. He sold magazines door to door, restocked shelves, did whatever he could to stay busy, and, more importantly, to learn. After graduation, Sam took a job at J.C. Penney in Des Moines, Iowa. This was no glamorous posting. He earned $65 a month and had to live in a modest boarding house. But to Sam, it was the perfect training ground. At Penny's, he was immersed in the daily rhythms of retail, stocking, pricing, returns, receipts. He watched managers make decisions, watched what sold quickly and what gathered dust. His boss saw the spark early. Sam was a natural seller. His shelves always moved product, even if his handwriting on sales slips was so bad they had to redo half of them. The customers didn't care, because Sam wasn't selling paper or socks. He was selling trust, efficiency, eye contact, friendly prices. You know, the kind of thing that never goes out of style. But Sam wasn't content with learning the old ways. He kept asking questions. Why are we doing it this way? Could we place the socks closer to the counter? What if we opened earlier on Saturdays? He didn't have authority to change things, not yet, but he was already thinking like someone who would. And that bothered some people. Managers didn't always like being questioned. The retail world in the early 1940s was conservative. Top-down, tradition ruled. Sam saw cracks in the foundation. He saw opportunity. But for the moment, he kept those thoughts to himself. Then came World War II. Sam joined the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps and served across the country, helping with logistics and communications. He didn't fire weapons, but he moved them. And in doing so, he learned one of the most important lessons of his life. Efficiency is everything. If a crate of supplies arrived late, someone could die. The stakes were higher than any business deal, but the systems were the same. Supply chains, timing, coordination. It was like retail, but life and death. By the time the war ended, Sam was ready. Not just ready to work, but ready to lead. He came home with savings in his pocket and discipline in his bones. He married Helen Robson, a sharp, independent-minded woman from a well-off family in Claremore, Oklahoma. And it was Helen's father, not Sam's own, who loaned him $20,000 to buy his first store. The target? A small Ben Franklin variety store in Newport, Arkansas, part of a franchise chain that sold everything from toothpaste to toys. Sam had no experience running his own shop, but he had a vision. The store had potential, but it was stale. The layout was rigid. Prices were static. The aisles were cluttered. Sam walked in and saw possibility, not just for better shelves or nicer paint, but for a different philosophy. He wanted to serve people the way he had learned in Des Moines, with efficiency, energy, and a smile, but also with new ideas, longer hours, better lighting, quicker restocking, and, most importantly, lower prices. And that's where he ran into his first real battle. See, the Ben Franklin franchise had a standard markup policy, basically how much profit you make on top of your costs. Sam ignored it. He negotiated directly with suppliers, ordered in bulk, and slashed prices. Also, he could offer deals that other store owners said were impossible. But Sam's store was packed. Word spread fast. Small-town families flocked to the aisles. They didn't care about brand names. They cared about price, about service, about convenience. And Sam was offering all three, in a way that felt both new and familiar. In 5 years, he turned that store into the top-performing Ben Franklin location in the region. He was just getting started. And then he lost it. Because in all his ambition, all his obsession with pricing and layout and lighting and movement, Sam forgot to read one very important clause in his lease. The building wasn't his, and neither was the land. Next time, we'll see how one sentence buried in fine print nearly destroyed Sam Walton's dream, and how losing everything became the greatest advantage of his life. By 1950, Sam Walton had done what every small-town shopkeeper dreams of. He'd turned a sleepy, underperforming five and dime into a retail goldmine. In just 5 years, his Ben Franklin store in Newport, Arkansas, had quadrupled its sales. It wasn't a fluke. It was obsession. Sam worked constantly, rearranging shelves, negotiating with wholesalers, keeping prices razor-thin, and greeting customers by name. He even installed a self-service layout, still a novelty at the time. Customers no longer had to wait behind a counter and request items. They could walk the aisles, pick things up, feel them, make a decision. It was retail democracy, and the town loved it. His secret weapon was simple: volume over margin. Sell it cheaper, sell more of it, and keep the shelves moving. It went against every traditional retail rule, but it worked. His wife, Helen, kept the books. His brother helped with stocking. It was a family operation, but the energy came from Sam, whose feet rarely stopped moving. And then came the knock on the door. It wasn't a customer, it was the landlord. Sam had been renting the store space on a 5-year lease. He'd signed the deal quickly when he first bought the place, thrilled just to get started. What he hadn't realized, or hadn't thought through, was that the lease contained a clause allowing the property owner to refuse renewal without cause. And now, with the store booming, the landlord had changed his mind. The lease would not be renewed. The building, and all the improvements Sam had paid for out of pocket, would be handed over to someone else. Worse, the landlord's new tenant would be Sam's competitor. Just like that, everything he had built, every shelf, every system, every customer relationship, was walking out the door. Most people would have collapsed, quit, blamed the system, taken a safer job somewhere else. Not Sam Walton. He was furious, sure, but he was also focused. If anything, the betrayal lit a new fire inside him. From that day forward, Sam vowed never again to build success on someone else's land. He would control the dirt, the doors, and every deal attached to it. So he packed up his family, his ambition, and everything he'd learned, and moved to a tiny town few had ever heard of, Bentonville, Arkansas. At the time, Bentonville was more dirt road than destination. It had a population of fewer than 3,000, a modest courthouse square, and exactly one blinking traffic light. But what it did have was potential. It was central, rural, and filled with the kind of hard-working, frugal families Sam knew he could serve. He opened a new Ben Franklin franchise, Walton's Five and Dime, this time buying not just the business, but the building itself. He wasn't going to repeat his mistake, and from the start, he treated the store as more than just a place to sell goods. It was a laboratory. He tracked which displays attracted the most attention. He timed how long customers spent in each section. He even watched how they walked, where they slowed, where they skipped, and he kept pushing prices lower. He drove hundreds of miles each week to wholesalers. Sometimes he'd buy in massive bulk and store overstock in his garage or warehouse just to get a discount. His competitors called it reckless. Sam called it strategy. Helen, always practical, imposed one rule. He couldn't expand beyond their means. For every new experiment, Sam had to justify the cost, not in theory, but in math. The tension between her caution and his ambition became a secret weapon. She kept him grounded. He kept her moving. Together, they created a strange formula, part frugal farmer, part retail scientist, part corporate pirate. But still, something bugged Sam. He was trapped inside a franchise. Ben Franklin's stores gave him some autonomy, but not enough. There were limits to what he could stock, rules about pricing, restrictions on store size, promotions, suppliers. And Sam hated restrictions. He wanted to go bigger, not just another location, a whole network. He wanted control, scale, systems that worked across miles, not just corners. So he started sketching. He drew up plans for a new kind of store, one that would offer variety like a department store, prices like a discount outlet, and location access to everyday people, not just city elites. It sounded wild, too ambitious, unthinkable for a man running a single store in a town with more cows than stop signs. But Sam had already lost everything once. He had nothing to prove, and everything to try. And in the next episode, we'll see how Bentonville became ground zero for a retail model no one saw coming, and how a little store called Walmart took its first breath. Bentonville, Arkansas, 1951. The town didn't look like the birthplace of anything revolutionary. Just red dirt, sleepy storefronts, and a courthouse square where folks still waved to strangers and judged people by the polish on their boots. But for Sam Walton, Bentonville wasn't just a place to recover from a setback. It was where he would quietly build the foundation for something bigger than anyone could imagine. By now, Sam had learned the lesson that every entrepreneur eventually faces. It's not about what you sell, it's about how you move it. And Bentonville, surrounded by dozens of rural towns, all within a day's drive, gave him a logistics advantage that no big city could. These weren't towns with high rents or luxury shoppers. These were working families who valued price over polish, and Sam understood them perfectly. Inside his new Ben Franklin store, now fully under his control, Sam got to work refining his strategy. He tracked every sale, every trend, every customer habit. He experimented constantly. If one product moved faster when placed near the door, he'd move it. If it didn't, gone. No loyalty to brands. No patience for slow inventory. What he wanted wasn't just sales. He wanted patterns. And soon, a pattern emerged. People would drive miles to save money if the savings were real. That became his religion. He began scouting nearby towns, driving his old pickup truck down winding highways, stopping to walk through local shops, taking mental notes of prices, layouts, traffic flow. His car often doubled as a notepad, with figures scribbled on envelopes and receipts. And more importantly, Sam started building something even more valuable than a customer base: a buying system. Instead of going through standard franchised supply chains, he began contacting wholesalers directly. If he could cut out the middleman, he could lower prices even further. And if he could buy in bulk across several stores, those savings would multiply. It was here that Helen's rule, "Don't expand unless we can afford it," met Sam's ambition. The compromise: expand small, expand smart. He opened another store in Missouri, then another in Arkansas. Each location tested new ideas. Sam never assumed what worked in one town would work in another. He adjusted constantly. The stores were basic: fluorescent lights, cheap tile, hand-painted signs, no chandeliers, no music, no frills. But the prices were sharp. The employees were local and friendly, and the energy was unmistakable. Sam didn't believe in perfect polish. He believed in relentless learning. And behind the scenes, he was sketching something radical, a new store, with a new name, that wouldn't just serve towns, it would connect them. His idea? Instead of placing one store in a large urban hub and expecting people to come to it, what if you flipped the model? What if you put stores in small towns, lots of them, and then built the distribution system yourself to support them? At the time, no one else was doing this. It sounded insane. Large retailers were chasing cities, glamour, and foot traffic. Sam was chasing farmland, gravel roads, and people who bought laundry soap in bulk. But Bentonville was becoming his map room. There, in a cluttered back office, he started drawing routes, not just for expansion, but for delivery trucks. He imagined a central warehouse where goods could be shipped in bulk, then distributed efficiently to dozens of stores. It would cut waste, cut cost, and keep prices low, without sacrificing profit. He wasn't thinking about a store anymore. He was thinking about a system. And then came the name, Walmart. He dropped the E because it looked cleaner on signs. Simple, direct, local. And most importantly, it was his. No more franchises, no more limits. Just the vision, the blueprint, and a truckload of ambition. In 1962, the first Walmart opened in Rogers, Arkansas. It was plain. It was underwhelming. But it worked. Customers walked in and saw the difference immediately. Wider aisles, lower prices, shelves stacked high with items they actually used, and none of the velvet ropes or uppity attitude found in city department stores. It was a revolution, hiding in plain sight. Sam Walton had officially stepped into retail history, but he didn't make an announcement. He made a distribution center. Next time, we'll ride along as that system grows faster than anyone expected, and how Walmart's small-town strategy started steamrolling the giants of American retail. Because Sam wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing scale. When Sam Walton opened the first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas, in the summer of 1962, there were no press releases, no investors flying in from New York, no grand ribbon cutting with champagne and cameras. Just a plain building, concrete floors, fluorescent lights, and shelves stocked higher than anyone thought was reasonable. The sign outside didn't say, "Welcome to the future." It just said, "Walmart," in block letters, blue on white. But inside, something truly revolutionary was happening. From day one, Sam knew exactly who he was trying to serve: rural and working-class families who needed to stretch every dollar. Still, Sam kept his lifestyle shockingly modest. He drove the same truck, wore $8 watches, and famously said, "Why do I need a yacht? I've got Walmart." He believed in thrift, even as he became the richest man in America. In an age when corporate leaders were becoming celebrities, Sam Walton remained something of an anomaly, a billionaire who refused luxury, a CEO who still ate at diners and knew the price of toilet paper by heart. But while he projected humility, he was building an empire with military precision. And in the next episode, we'll look behind that folksy smile, at the tougher side of Sam Walton. The side that fought unions, squeezed suppliers, and pushed his people to the edge. Because Walmart didn't become a juggernaut on charm alone. To the outside world, Sam Walton looked like the friendliest billionaire you could ever meet. He wore worn-out jeans, tucked in his shirt, and called people by their first name. He held meetings in coffee shops, showed up unannounced to stores, and refused to move his company headquarters from small-town Bentonville, Arkansas, even after Walmart became a national powerhouse. But behind the charm, behind the warm smile and the pickup truck, lived a strategist with sharp elbows and steel in his spine. Because while Sam treated his customers like royalty, he played hardball with just about everyone else. Let's start with unions. From the very beginning, Sam Walton was wary of organized labor. He believed, or claimed to believe, that unions would slow things down, add bureaucracy, and raise costs in ways that would ultimately hurt the customer. But that didn't mean he simply disagreed. It meant he fought them with everything he had. When union organizers showed up at Walmart stores, they were met with lightning-fast counter-campaigns. Managers were trained to detect early signs of organizing. Team meetings were quickly held. Videos were shown. Messaging was sharp. We're a family, not a bureaucracy. If you're unhappy, tell us. Don't bring in outsiders. And it worked. To this day, Walmart remains largely non-unionized, not by accident, but by design. Some critics called it manipulation, others called it survival. But Sam never wavered. In his view, unions were a threat to the thing he valued most: control. Then there were suppliers. If you sold to Walmart, you knew two things: the volume would change your life, and the pressure might break you. Walmart didn't negotiate softly. They demanded lower prices, faster deliveries, tighter margins. If your product wasn't performing, it was pulled. If your competitor could beat your price by half a cent, you had a choice: match it or disappear. There were stories of suppliers crying in meetings, of factories retooling overnight, of contracts rewritten with 10 words. And yet, they kept coming back, because Walmart meant sales. Lots of them, even if it meant shrinking your profit margin to the bone. The brand was becoming so powerful that not being in Walmart was more dangerous than giving up control. Sam's message was consistent: save the customer money, period. If that meant squeezing suppliers, so be it. If that meant building warehouses in cornfields, done. If that meant shaving fractions of a cent off the price of a toothbrush, he'd do it, and then make his staff explain how they could shave off one more. This was not some casual operation. Walmart was a machine, efficient, relentless, fine-tuned for speed and savings. But here's the paradox. Inside this pressure cooker, Sam fostered one of the most unique corporate cultures in American history. He genuinely believed in his people, or as he insisted on calling them, associates. He walked the floor with them. He shook hands with truck drivers and janitors. He remembered names. He celebrated milestones. He gave bonuses. He pushed for employee stock ownership. And yet, he also paid wages low enough to raise eyebrows. The logic was consistent. Every dollar saved at Walmart, whether from an employee's paycheck, a supplier's contract, or a store's overhead, was a dollar passed to the customer. It wasn't greed, he insisted. It was philosophy. And customers believed him. They kept coming. They brought their neighbors. They lined up at grand openings, bought towels by the dozen, and sent Walmart trucks rolling deeper into rural America than any major brand had dared to go. By the mid-1980s, Walmart was expanding faster than almost any company in U.S. history. The stock exploded. Revenue soared. Sam Walton, the milk-selling boy from Oklahoma, was now the richest man in the country. But you wouldn't know it if you saw him. He still wore trucker caps, still ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, still flew commercial and sat in coach. If someone asked about his wealth, he'd shrug and say it didn't mean much if he couldn't pass the savings to the customer. But don't be fooled. Behind every A.W. Shucks moment was a spreadsheet. Behind every homespun saying was a calculated plan. Sam used his humility the way generals use maps, to win. He once said, "There's absolutely no limit to what plain, ordinary working people can accomplish if they're given the opportunity and the encouragement." But he could have added, "and if they're willing to work harder, longer, and smarter than anyone else." In the next episode, we'll look at Sam in the final years of his career. Already a billionaire, already a legend, and yet still out on the road, checking stores, asking questions, writing notes. Because for Sam Walton, the game was never about being rich. It was about never, ever standing still. By the late 1980s, Sam Walton was no longer just a businessman. He was a full-blown American legend. Walmart had ballooned into a national behemoth, with thousands of stores, tens of thousands of employees, and annual revenues that made Wall Street take notice. In 1985, Forbes declared him the richest man in the United States. You'd expect a man like that to start wearing tailored Italian suits, flying private jets, maybe buying a penthouse in Manhattan or a ranch in Aspen. But that wasn't Sam. Instead, he stuck with his old truck, a 1979 red and white Ford F-150 with no air conditioning and a cracked dashboard. He wore a $6 Timex watch, khaki pants, and simple shirts bought in bulk. His idea of a power lunch, a ham sandwich in the cab of his pickup, parked outside a store he was just stopping by to check on. The wealth didn't change him, it amplified him. He still walked Walmart stores unannounced, chatting with associates, straightening merchandise on shelves, even pushing the occasional cart. He asked tough questions. Why is this product in the wrong spot? Why is the end cap messy? Why are there 10 customers in line at one open register? And if he didn't like the answers, he didn't yell. He just took notes, then quietly fixed it the next day. Sam never believed in ivory towers. His office in Bentonville was modest, his desk cluttered with memos and half-used legal pads. His walls weren't lined with awards or degrees, but with maps, charts, and handwritten reports. He didn't want distance. He wanted data. He wanted truth. And he got it by staying close. His leadership style was simple. Be visible. Be curious. Be frugal. While other CEOs spoke in jargon, Sam talked about people. While others hired PR firms to build their image, Sam built his reputation in person, aisle by aisle, handshake by handshake. But even as he became a symbol of working-class humility, he understood his power. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Sam accepted it while hooked up to an oxygen tank, battling bone cancer, but he still wore his Walmart cap and flashed his signature smile. In his speech, he didn't talk about wealth or strategy or even success. He talked about service. "I feel the responsibility of being this successful," he said, "and I want very much to make a difference." That same year, he published his autobiography, Sam Walton, Made in America. It wasn't ghost-written fluff. It was a straight-talking, story-packed look at how a guy from small-town Oklahoma built an empire without losing his grip on reality or his sense of humor. He openly admitted mistakes. He praised competitors. He gave credit to his wife Helen, his family, his associates. He even shared the secret to Walmart's growth. We're all working together. That's the secret. But make no mistake, Sam was no softy. Behind the humility was still the same man who once drove 500 miles just to beat a competitor's price by 2 cents. He didn't slow down, not even when his doctors told him to. In fact, in the final year of his life, Sam visited over 60 Walmart stores in person. He'd walk the aisles, sit in on meetings, watch, listen, nudge, correct. He was tired, yes, but he couldn't imagine doing anything else. Because Walmart wasn't just his company, it was his canvas. The place where every idea, every mistake, every ounce of effort had left a mark. On April 5th, 1992, Sam Walton passed away in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was 74. Walmart didn't close. It didn't pause. The shelves were restocked, the doors opened, and the greeters smiled. Because that's exactly what Sam would have wanted. He once said, "High expectations are the key to everything." And even in death, he held his company to that standard. His funeral was attended by presidents, business leaders, factory workers, and cashiers. No one wore tuxedos. No one needed to. They were there not just to mourn a man, but to acknowledge a movement. In the next and final episode, we'll step back and ask the bigger questions. What did Sam Walton really leave behind? A retail empire, a pricing model, or something deeper, a shift in how Americans think about work, money, and value? And most importantly, we'll finally share the one rule he never broke, the one that held all the others together. Sam Walton didn't leave behind a fancy tower with his name on it, or a curated museum filled with crystal plaques and designer suits. He didn't build a shrine. He built a system, one so invisible, so ordinary-looking, that most people don't even realize they're living inside it. Because Walmart, the brand, is just the tip of the iceberg. The real legacy is the idea beneath it. The shift in how we shop, what we expect, what we pay, and even how businesses treat scale. That was Sam's gift, and maybe his burden too. He gave America lower prices, but also lower wages. He gave rural towns access to more goods than ever before, but sometimes at the cost of local shops. He created thousands of jobs while fighting tooth and nail against unionization. He democratized shopping, but centralized power. Was it good? Was it bad? Like most revolutions, it was both. By the time Sam passed away in 1992, Walmart had more than 1,900 stores and over 200,000 employees. It was the largest private employer in the United States, and still growing. But what surprised many wasn't the scale. It was the philosophy that somehow survived inside it. Sam's ideas were still everywhere. Stores still looked modest. Prices were still aggressive. Greeters still stood by the doors with genuine smiles. The morning cheers still echoed through stockrooms before opening hours. The company still celebrated frugality, hustle, and frontline wisdom. And above all, it still listened to the customer. That was the one rule Sam never broke. "The customer is the boss," he used to say. "If you don't take care of the customer, someone else will." He didn't mean it as a slogan. He meant it as a strategy. Every decision, from product selection to lighting to parking lot design, flowed through that lens. Would this save the customer time? Would it save them money? Would it make them come back? If yes, do it. If not, scrap it. And that clarity, that almost obsessive customer focus, became the silent engine behind everything Walmart did. It's easy to think that the company's success came from size, from buying power, from bullying suppliers or cutting costs. And yes, all of that played a role. But it was Sam's rule that tied it all together. He knew that customers weren't looking for magic. They were looking for reliability. A can of beans that's always 20 cents cheaper. Socks that never move aisles. A greeter who remembers their name. Simple things, but consistent, predictable, trustworthy. That's what builds an empire. Not just capital, but credibility. And Walmart, for all its scale, never forgot that. But Sam's influence went